Welcome everybody. Hello, hello. Just wait a second for everybody to join. I'm Shaya Hecht. Took over OKclarity's account tonight to talk about complex trauma and inner child healing. I hope I can get to all of it. Otherwise, I guess we'll have to follow up. So let's talk about trauma, complex trauma, and inner child healing. Thank you everybody for being here. So what is trauma? So it's an overused word, that's for sure, but let's get clear exactly what trauma is. So trauma is a psychological trauma, I should say, is a unique individual experience of an event, or a series of events, or a set of enduring conditions in which an individual's ability to integrate his or her emotional experience is overwhelmed. So there's an overwhelming feeling, and the person from an event or a series of events, and the person is having a difficult time integrating that experience, and it's very overwhelming. That situation is perceived as threatening to one's safety or their security, their survival. It stimulates a response in one's system, which can be a fight or flight response, a freeze response, or a fawn response. Those mean that we're fighting the threat, we're running away from the threat, or we're frozen, or we are pleasing the person or the threat so that we don't feel threatened. So those are very normal responses to a traumatic incident or a series of incidents, and we'll get into exactly what complex trauma is in a little bit, but let's understand how the brain works when that happens. So there's different parts of the brain. I don't want to get too technical, but when there's a perceived threat that's overwhelming, the parts of your brain that hold memory and the parts of your brain that are rational shut down. They go completely offline, and the only part of the brain that's activated is the part of your brain that's there for survival. So it does whatever it takes in order for you to survive. But all the other parts of your brain are not really online. They're not active. And that's why we react with a fight or flight response, so that we can survive. So it's something that's very, very real, and we might feel a lot of shame about how we act when we're feeling threatened, but it's something that's not to be ashamed of. It's the way our body works. Our minds and our bodies are there to protect us from harm. And if we're feeling a threat, even if it's a perceived threat, that's the system that's going to kick in and overwhelm us. So it's totally, totally normal. So what happens is that we can have, let's say something happens to us in childhood, we can have a childhood wound. It's a psychic wound. It's what happens inside us and not what happens to us. So if there's an event that happens, it's not necessarily traumatizing. If it affects our system in a way we're overwhelmed and we can't integrate, then that's called traumatic. So let's say something happens to us. Let's say we have a certain need that's not being met. So if the adults around us aren't meeting that need, the memories and all of that stuff we just said are not, the part of our brain that stores memories not online. So where does that all go? That goes into our body somewhere, right? It gets stored somewhere, and we're not necessarily conscious of it, but the memory gets stored, beliefs around it get stored, the way that we wanted to act but couldn't act gets stored also. So there's a whole lot going on inside us that is getting sort of suppressed into ourselves, and we start to act in ways where we can't survive, whether that's, so sometimes we can't fight it off and we can't do anything like that. So instead we split off sort of from our personality in a way where that threat no longer is occurring. So let's say, for example, if I know that my need won't get met from the adult around me, I'm not going to express myself, let's say, right? Let's say if I take a risk and I express an emotion and I'm not getting support around it. So for example, as an example, I might just stop expressing myself and teach myself that it's not okay for me to have needs because they're not going to get met. So what happens to the part of me that has needs? It sort of, let's call it, gets exiled, gets pushed away, gets cast aside, and all of these things are still living on inside us, but in our conscious, where we are consciously and in the way that we function, we're just surviving at that point, right? So hopefully that makes a lot of sense. I see I have a question, I think. Okay, we'll get to that soon. Okay, so the way that so again, just to review, when there's trauma, we're overwhelmed, it's a perceived threat, It could be a series of events. It could be one event that's causing this threat. Our safety is being threatened. We go into the part of our brains that are rational and that hold memory are not online. They go offline. And what's online is just survival. That's the only thing we're trying to do. And our mind and our bodies work to help us survive. And therefore, every other part of what was going on gets pushed somewhere. And they get pushed inside our body. So the memories get pushed. What we wanted to do or could have done or wish we could have done might get pushed down. And beliefs about ourselves and all types of things get pushed away or cast aside, and we become the version of ourselves that will survive and be okay. So that's why you might have heard that the body plays a very important role in trauma work, because things are being stored in the body, and our body is the defense mechanism. Our minds and our body is the defense mechanism that is working for us. They're sort of helping us be able to survive at that point, right? So we split off the parts that are not surviving, they're not being met, they're wounds. So we split off from those parts, and our mind and body creates protection so that we could feel good, right? So that we could survive and be okay. Okay, so now let's talk about trauma and complex trauma. So trauma in the original, I guess not the original, but trauma, what people think of trauma is typically one event, right? One event, an event that's obvious. Let's say someone gets into a car accident, somebody is in a war, and they almost die. That's something that's very obvious, and that's considered trauma. Then there's something called complex trauma. So what's complex trauma? Complex trauma is it's a result of a series of repeated events. They're often invisible, quote unquote. They're not necessarily so obvious. They come from maltreatment or abuse or neglect, and they're situations where the child has little or no control of any perceived hope or escape. So growing up in an environment that has all that unpredictability and danger, maybe parental inconsistencies, emotional abandonment, these individuals are left with something you might call a hidden trauma, because it's not so obvious. They got split off and they got pushed away, and it's disrupting not only their psychological but also their neurological and emotional development. And that's what we're calling complex trauma. And if it happens in childhood, you might hear of it as developmental trauma. So these are things that are pervasive. They're often not so obvious, and somebody may come to therapy even and not know that they've been through trauma, because it's something that's sort of invisible. It felt normal when you were going through it, but it's something that absolutely may have overwhelmed your system, which put all those parts of your brain that you need offline, and instead you're in survival mode. So it's not a surprise that sometimes people are not aware that they've been through something like that. Okay, now, so therefore, to talk about the inner child. So now what you're left with is a child who has been wounded and has not been tended to. So the child is pushed aside, their needs are pushed aside, and that child now has a wound. The word trauma actually in Greek refers to wound. So it's a psychic wound, right? So it's a psychic wound, and that child is still wounded. So we may have developed a system, the mind and body has developed a system where you can survive, but there's still a wounded child that's inside. So when you're, let's say, reacting in the present moment, even in your adult life, to something, and it feels like an overreaction or it feels like an overwhelm, and you're wondering, why am I reacting that way? It's very possible that's coming because of the inner child wounds, because those wounds have not been tended to, and they're still there. And they have to be tended to in order for us to feel safe and okay. Okay, so that inner child, when we say inner child healing, that inner child needs to be tended to. So how would that happen? So what ends up happening is that safety has to be developed. When we've been traumatized, our safety has been compromised, right? And until we're feeling safe and we're able to feel okay, it's going to be very, very difficult to do any sort of healing. So when we're young and we're babies and we have parents who are attentive to us, so we learn how to co-regulate through our parenting. And through that co-regulation, we can now learn to self-regulate. But if that didn't happen, let's say, or if that's been threatened in some way, there's been a rupture. So now we don't know how to necessarily self-regulate, and we don't feel safe. And the concept of therapy would be that the therapist would now act as a co-regulator to help you learn how to feel safe and create safety within the therapeutic environment and give you a corrective experience where you're feeling safe. And now when you're feeling safe, you're able to really start to identify this system that was developed, where this child was cast aside, where there's parts of you that you had to be split off from, that are wounded, and then there were protection around that was created in order for you to survive, but they're no longer serving you, which is why you might be reacting to things, because they're not necessarily serving you anymore. Because, if you split off from a certain, let's say you have a belief that relationships are unsafe, and now you want to be in a relationship. So what do you do now, right? So maybe for your childhood, that was working for you, and that's great, that's amazing. You were able to feel safe by keeping distance from people, but now it may not be serving you. Maybe you're married, maybe you have children, and you want to feel close to them, and it's no longer serving you. So what we would have to do is to have safety in the present, learn how to regulate, and when we have that, and we're able to access yourself and feel okay, you're able to now go into the protective system, understand why there was this need to protect yourself from relationships. And now behind all of that, when all of that calms down, there's a child there who has wounds, who's holding on to beliefs about themselves that they can't be safe in relationships and things like that, which needs to be healed. So there are various ways to heal these things. But the ultimate goal is to create an integration where the child is reparented, and the child is no longer feeling that when, as we said, it's stored in the body a certain way. So what we have to do is sort of change the way that it's stored in the body. Right now it's stored in a way where it's sort of not attended to, and it's wounded and threatened, so to speak. And now what we have to do is to create a safety and a relationship with that wound where it can emerge and feel tended to and safe. So we're sort of like reparenting it. And we're also unburdening it from the beliefs that it has, which are really what they're being protected from, all those burdens. We could unburden it, and then we could integrate it into the system. So I don't know if I'm going to get into the technicalities of how that works, but we do have to go back in time. And people have parts of them that get very stressed about that, very afraid about that, and that makes a lot of sense. That's part of that protective system, where there's a belief that child who's wounded was not somebody who's okay, is not someone who's okay. And therefore, if we go back there, we're not going to like what we see and all of that. But those are all beliefs that are being held frozen in time from a time when there was a wound. But if that child would have had a supportive system around them, then they wouldn't have been traumatized. It would have been a terrible event, let's say, but they wouldn't necessarily have been traumatized, because the reason why their system got overwhelmed is because it was too much for them to handle alone. But when there's a supportive system there of people who have the capacity to help the child, like a parent, then that overwhelming wouldn't have necessarily happened, or would have been already unburdened and processed, and all that would have already happened. Because that didn't take place, it got stuck in time, it's frozen in time, and we sort of have to bring it into the present, integrate it into the present. Of course, only through safety and carefully with the help of a therapist, and only when people are ready. And this could take a very, 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 very long time. However, everybody here is worth that very, very, very long time. Even though the belief system that's been developed might say that you're not worth it, but of course you're worth it. You're absolutely worth it. A person could make headway without going into that deep, deep, deep healing, just by learning how to co-regulate and self-regulate. There could be a tremendous amount that a person could gain from that. So, you don't have to go into trauma therapy thinking that you're going to have to unravel everything right away. Of course not. Creating safety alone is a tremendous thing, and it's something that's very, very valuable. And also working with that protective layer, even before we get and bring up that inner child, just to calm things down, help people feel a lot lighter and a lot safer. And eventually we could go there. Eventually we'll be able to go there. So I hope I answered this person's questions of what the trauma therapist does. That's what they do. They help. The number one thing that they need to do is help you feel safe. That's the first thing. Naturally, if there was a wound within a relationship, like an attachment wound, like let's say there was a wound with the relationship with your parent or something like that, so naturally coming to therapy is something that's going to be extremely terrifying to your system, because the wound happened within a relationship. And there are beliefs that have been created now about relationships or about authority or something like that. And coming to therapy, it could be a very, very big challenge. So sometimes people come into therapy and they have a very hard time talking, or they feel very overwhelmed. That's something that's totally expected and normal, even though people tend to feel a lot of shame about that. But of course, it's totally normal and expected because, again, the system's feeling overwhelmed, the memories are being activated, even though it's subconscious. But of course, everything from the past is coming up, and there has been a protection around connecting deeply and showing oneself authentically to somebody else for a very good reason. And now they might feel like they're expected to do that, which could be terrifying to the system. And that makes a lot of sense. So the therapist's job is to help the client feel safe, which is, again, through co-regulation, without even talking about the past, without even delving into anything. We just have to co-regulate and learn how to feel safe. Okay. I see another question. Okay. I couldn't fully process the question, but this takes a very long time. Yes, it's normal for it to take a long time. It could take a very long time. The defenses have been created for a very long time. Now, sometimes there's a lot of shame about the defenses that have been created. If you've been following me for a while, hopefully that's getting better, because I talk a lot about this protective system. The protective system was there to help you survive, because a child cannot be expected to survive. It's not something that a child can do on their own. They don't have the capacity to do it. So there was nothing wrong with you. The reason you got traumatized was because there was a lack of support. Right? So it's what happened inside you. It's not the event itself. The event itself didn't have to be traumatizing necessarily, but there was a lack of support. So because of that lack of support, that's why the protective system steps in and says, hey, we got this. We'll take over from here. You're just a child. We're going to help you. So this protective system is something that's beautiful and helpful. And the mind and body is largely a protective system to protect you from threats. And there's a real threat, a real perceived threat that's here. The problem is that, not a problem, but the reality is that the mind and body pick up threats when they're not necessarily threats at this point, because the radar detector is on very, very high because it's trying to protect you, and it's frozen in time, and it thinks that there's people are still a threat, or this person might be a threat. They remind you of that person. It doesn't mean that they're necessarily a threat, but it's a perceived threat, and that's something that's very real and nothing to make light of. And what we have to do is now have a corrective experience where we could create a new safety around these things, which takes a long time and a lot of work, and that's okay. Okay. There were a couple of questions that were submitted, so let's get to some of those questions. So one question was, what's the difference between trauma and complex trauma? So I hopefully explained that. Complex trauma is more invisible, more pervasive. It's about what didn't happen, largely. The question about, can I do inner child healing on my own? So it's a great question. A person has the ability to do inner child healing on their own. It's much harder, but it's possible to do it. If you want a book that might guide you, there's a book called Self-Therapy. I forgot the rest of the title, but it's written by Jay Early, which is like an IFS perspective where you could do it on your own. There's a workbook on that also, where a person could start to like recognize their wounds, the protection around their wounds and stuff like that. And it's a helpful book. And I think there's also an app for it. I forgot the exact name, but if you message me, I'll try to find the app for you. So yeah, but the reason why typically people want to do that on their own is because they're scared of therapy, which makes a lot of sense. But the proper therapist will help you be safe. They will help you be safe. It's therapy at that point, I once wrote a post about, is not necessarily a safe space, because to you it's not safe, but it is a brave space, and you have the ability to be brave. There are parts of you that don't know how old you are and what's going on, and that this is not necessarily a threat. So they're being activated at that point, and that makes sense. But a therapist who's in tune with trauma will understand it. They've seen it a million times before. They know exactly what that's about, and they're there to help you through that process. And at any point, if you're feeling overwhelmed, they should first of all pick up on it on their own. It's not that hard to pick up on. And if they can't pick up on it, to be able to, you're in charge of therapy. Sometimes people think like therapists are just so smart and experts and know better, but pay attention to yourself. You're very smart. You have a gut, and maybe things are confusing right now to you. So talk it out with maybe a couple of people or whatever, but the bottom line is that you have the ability to walk away from therapy if it's not serving you. That doesn't mean that trauma therapy is not for you. It's very possible that the therapist isn't for you or the modality they were using isn't for you. Somebody asked a question about pandas and OCD. I don't really want to get into that right now, but they can do the self-therapy that I described. Interestingly, there are people who believe that OCD type of presentation is it does come from trauma, and it's a part of you that wants to gain control because your whole world has felt out of control. I'm not saying I subscribe to that idea necessarily, but there's definitely what to be said about that. So sometimes the classic OCD therapies, if they're not working for you, it's very possible that underneath there's a bigger trauma, and you said you're in OCD therapy, maybe explore trauma work. Okay. Hopefully that was clear. If anybody has any more questions, I'll take them real quick. But otherwise, hopefully that was clear. So we could do a quick review. The review is trauma is a perceived threat. It overwhelms the system. It's not the event that happened per se. As you know, there could be 4 people in a car accident. One person could get into a car. 3 of them get into a car and 1 person can't. So it's not necessarily the event itself. Okay? The event itself doesn't have to be traumatic. There's a lot of factors that go into it. And if there's overwhelm, then that's when it's going to happen. When there's an overwhelm, the parts of your brain go offline, and now you're only in survival mode. That's trauma. If your life has not been disrupted in any way, even though you've been through a scary experience, that's not trauma. Right? It's a scary, stressful experience, and it's real, it's significant, but it's not trauma. Trauma means it's really, really disrupted your life in a significant way. Complex trauma is that invisible piece, right, where it's a little bit unclear, it's pervasive, it happens over time, it's often a lack of attunement and neglect, and it's not necessarily something that's so obvious, and again, you have to split off from yourself in order to survive. Whatever you had to split off from gets stored inside you, and that creates a psychic wound, right? That psychic wound is still there, even as an adult, even if a lot of time has passed. Don't let anyone convince you that if time has passed, you should be over something. It's a ridiculous statement. They don't understand anything about trauma if that's what they're going to tell you. Right? It's frozen in the body and the defensive system that's there is going to be stuck in time, and that's where it's going to be, and it's going to be hypervigilant, looking out for threats all the time. Trauma clients are by far the most attuned clients to the way that the therapist is, and there's a very good reason for that. And I appreciate it very much when I'm challenged because they're very attuned to everything. Any motion I make is going to be noticed, and it's going to be perceived if it's a threat or not. And I became a much better therapist by paying attention and getting feedback from my clients. So it's something that could actually be a superpower in a way. Trauma clients are by far, ones who are working on themselves are far more attuned to their children than other people because they're very aware and very sensitive to any type of subtlety in a relationship. They know what they lack, they know what they need, they know what they could give to somebody else. So the inner child healing is about going back in time, reparenting the inner child, unburdening them from everything they've been through, and providing that support. So now when the body stores that memory, it's stored in a much safer, it feels so much safer, it's integrated back into the system in a way where we're no longer feeling that wound, and there's healing that has taken place. Okay, someone asked about somatic type of therapy. So really all trauma work should be from the bottom up, right? Because it's being stored in the body. So if you're in a trauma therapy and your therapist has never mentioned the body, so it could be it's effective, I hope it's working for you, but if it's not, then you might want to start exploring like more body type of work. Okay, and another question. Right, so the person who's panicking when they have to go to a simcha and stuff like that, the answer is because it doesn't matter that time has passed. There is a psychic wound that exists inside you from your inner child, and has been hurt by people, and perhaps there's certain settings that trigger the fears, and the protective system's telling you, don't go anywhere near that because you're going to be very hurt, you're going to be very overwhelmed, so don't go, and it's causing you to panic so that you stay away from the simcha. Right? It's stuck in time, and it thinks that there's a real threat that's going to happen because it's protecting a child, it's not protecting you. It doesn't know that you have the ability to be at a simcha and get space from all the pain. It doesn't know any of that. And so therefore it's reacting. So trauma work would help you learn how to get space from that protective part. It would help you go deeper into the system so that you could heal that child so that you don't start panicking from these type of events. I hope this was helpful, and everyone should have a wonderful night. Take care.